Well, it's good to see everybody out this evening. I still haven't gotten used to the time change. I don't know about you, so it still feels like it's in the middle of the night. But hopefully, you'll think that the time that we have spent together this evening will be beneficial. I hope and pray that's the case. You know, a lot of times in the Bible, the image of a flock or the picture or an example of a flock and a shepherd is used. You know, for instance, David said, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," in Psalm 23. And in the New Testament, when it comes to talking about the church, a lot of times the image is used to talk about the flock. And so that's what I want to talk about this evening for a little bit. I want to talk about the flock. Usually, when we talk about elders, we talk about the elders' qualifications and their responsibilities, and that's good. Those are all good things. They are lined out. We should make sure we are having men appointed that are meeting those qualifications and duties. However, tonight, I want to talk about really sort of the opposite of that. I want to talk about more of the congregation's responsibilities toward the elders. And so, if we want to be successful, we need to have elders leading, but we need to have the flock following and doing things that are pleasing to God. We want the church here to be successful. And so tonight I want to talk about responsibilities of the congregation toward the elders. And hopefully this study will be beneficial to us. Let's jump right in when we talk about this subject. I've got 4 points, and we'll try to cover quite a bit of ground with the 4 points. In the first place, well, my point already jumped up there. My element of surprise is gone. But in the first place, when we talk about responsibilities of the congregation toward elders, the first point is, one of our responsibilities is we need to submit to them. And I want to look at Hebrews 13, in verse 17. The Hebrew writer said, "Obey your leaders and submit to them, for they are keeping watch over your souls, as those who will have to give an account. Let them do this with joy and not groaning, for that will be of no advantage to you." Now, there are some parts here mentioned about the leaders, how they ought to do this with joy and not with groaning. And those are all good points, but I really want to focus on the other pieces, talking to those that would follow. So, 2 key words are mentioned here: obey your leaders and submit to them. And so the Hebrew writer talked about the responsibility of the congregation or the followers toward the elders. So terms like obey and submit, that implies the presence of authority, number one, that was given to them by God. The idea behind obey includes a willingness to trust and a willingness to be persuaded. So when you obey, that means I need to listen, I need to comply with. We really understand that picture if we talk about parents and children. You need your parents, or you need parents to instruct children, and children need to comply. They need to listen, be persuaded by what the parents have told them to do. And so we talk about this idea of obeying. It's easy to obey the elders whenever they make decisions that I agree with, and decisions that I understand. That's easy for me to obey then. And I can get on board with that. If it's something that I already thought we should be doing anyway, I'll obey. However, there are times when elders make decisions that are not understood by the members of the congregation. Maybe there's details that are delicate and the rest of the group doesn't even know about it. Well, elders are going to have to make decisions there. And the Hebrew writer tells us we need to obey as far as their decisions go. We'll talk more about it as we go along through here, but if the elders have proven themselves to be trustworthy, then we need to have enough trust in them to understand that they're making good judgments and then comply with their decisions. So that's that word, obey. This word, submit to them. Submit means to yield or to give in to. So I'm going to yield my will to those that are in a leadership position. And so the relationship with elders in the congregation means that their decision is going to prevail over ours. It's going to prevail over mine. There's a lot of decisions that I think would be good. We all have opinions. We all have think-sos. And everybody thinks their opinion is the right one, right? I'll agree with your opinion as long as you agree that mine's right, is usually how people's attitude works. But the idea of submitting is, well, I've got a thought or an idea, but the elders have made a decision. I need to submit to them. If it's not wrong, if it's not unscriptural, if it's not, biblically incorrect, then I need to submit to them. And so there's a duty on the congregation in working with the elders. And again, as we're going through this, the elders have a duty to do things the right way. We've got men in position that are meeting qualifications. They've got responsibilities, but we've got responsibilities as well. If there's a conflict between my judgment and the elders, what ought I to do? Well, I've got to submit to them. That's what the Hebrew writer tells us that we ought to do. One of the things that is important here is the reasoning behind all this. A lot of times as parents, you tell your children to do something. Why? Well, it doesn't matter because I said to do it. A lot of times that's the way with God too, but sometimes there's reasoning behind it. So we're told to obey your leaders and submit to them. The reasoning behind that is they're keeping watch over your souls. They are keeping watch over your souls. The elders should be looking out for our best interest. They're trying to get us to heaven. And so that's a big responsibility that Greg and Gordon have as they are making decisions. They want us all here to go to heaven. And so when they're making decisions and we've got the responsibility to choose whether we're going to obey that or submit to them, we need to keep in mind that the decisions they're making they're watching over our souls. They want us to go to heaven. And so it's easy to obey and submit to elders knowing that they have concern for your soul. If we thought, they couldn't care less about me, then it may be difficult. But knowing that that's the priority, we ought to be able to submit to them. In 1 Corinthians 11 and verse 1, Paul told the brethren at Corinth, so he says, "Be ye followers of me, even as I also am of Christ." This verse doesn't have anything really to do about elders at all, but the point here is that Paul told them to follow him. You ought to follow me because I'm following Christ over here. And so we ought not to just blindly follow. And so I'm not saying that. Our first point we're making is we need to submit to the elders. We ought not to just blindly follow. If they're doing something wrong, then we obviously ought to not do that. But assuming that they are following first the Lord of his instruction, just like Paul told those at Corinth, then you can follow me because I'm following Christ. We ought to be able to say, I'm going to submit to the elders because I know they are trying to do what's right. They are trying to do the best that they could do. And so as Paul followed Christ, others could follow him. In the same way, if elders are ruling in the right way, then we ought to be able to say, I can submit to them. They're trying to do what's right. In Acts 20 and verse 30, remember here Paul warned the Ephesian elders that there would be some even among them who would kind of get off track. They would go astray. He says, "Also of your own self shall men arise, speaking perverse things to draw away disciples after them." And so here's the point that we're making. There's two sides of this thing. Ought to submit, ought to obey. But if somebody starts speaking perverse things and draws people away from them, then we ought to be on guard for that. We ought not to follow somebody that is doing that. Lastly, in Philippians 3 and verse 17, Paul told the brethren at Philippi, "Brethren, join in following my example and observe those who walk according to the pattern you have in us." And so, again, we ought not to follow if we're leading the wrong direction. But if there is a worthy pattern, if there's a worthy example being set, then Paul told the brethren, join in following my example. I'm setting a good example for you, and you can follow that. And so elders have a hard job to do. In this first point, we're just laying some groundwork. We need to submit to the elders, the rulers that we have over us. They've got a difficult job, and Christians who benefit from their efforts should be willing to cooperate with them by submitting to them and obeying them. The second place, as we kind of build on this, what's our responsibility toward the elders? Secondly, I would say we need to honor them. I've spent some time just thinking about this, putting this lesson together. Everybody here, we ought to respect and honor them. There's the best people in the community, the best people in this area are those that are Christians. We are worshiping with some of the best people that are in this area. God-fearing people, right? And so we ought to respect and honor everybody here. But tonight we're talking about the elders. It's not enough just to respect them as individuals. They're fine people. I respect them as an individual. But we need to respect, they've got a God-given duty to hold this office of an elder. A God-given duty to shepherd the flock, shepherd the church. This is the Lord's church that we're trying to operate here. And the elders have a responsibility to keep things going in the right direction. And that's tough business. I think you'd agree if you'd stop and think that is a really tough, tall task. And I think maybe myself included, I think sometimes I can look from the outside and, say, well, it's not that hard. But is it though? Have I really thought about how difficult a task that is? And so they're owed honor because of the position that they are holding. In 1 Timothy 5 and verse 17, Paul told Timothy, "Let the elders who rule well be considered worthy of double honor, especially those who labor in preaching and teaching." Here Paul told Timothy, so Greg preaches and teaches. That's an honorable thing. He's performing or in the role of an elder, and he's teaching. That's an honorable thing. Elders who rule well should be considered worthy of double honor. I mean, that's the highest guard that you could receive, the highest regard. Elders who are serving in a local church. I was thinking about that. For what purpose? Just because somebody has maybe, they've are in that position, like, oh, they're an elder, they're worthy of double honor. Well, it's those who rule well. So there's some ownership on their behalf of what is done. But those who are serving in the position of elder, they've worked a lifetime developing character and the things needed in order to meet the qualifications of an elder. Do you realize that? You think about that? So we've got some younger men here who they're not even close to being an adult yet. They're not close to getting married. They're not even close to even thinking about having children. But they are already developing some of the qualifications needed to be an elder one day. That's a good thing. There's young women here who are working toward being strong Christians when they grow up. That's a good thing. And so people who are in that office met qualifications, they're ruling well, they've spent a lifetime preparing for this work, and they have willingly agreed to fulfill the role. There's a lot of people that maybe are qualified, but they don't want that responsibility. And so I hope you agree with me in talking about this double honor that's due there. Somebody that's willing to fulfill that role and has met the qualifications, that's considered a thing to be held in high regard. And so we should honor our elders. I think there's a lot of us here. I know that I've been a member of a church with no elders. Actually, the majority of my time spent as a Christian, I've been a part of a church with no elders. And we should be able to think about that and think about how this is God's plan. This was His design for the church. We are in a good situation here. And so just remember that whenever we are considering them. And we'll talk more about what we ought to do, but remember to hold them in high regard. I've got a picture here of James Garfield. Now, he was the 20th president of the United States. And he served actually less than 4 months before he was assassinated. He was shot, and he spent some time trying to recover from that before he eventually passed away. James Garfield was a member of the church. And one of the things that he said that really has just stuck with me ever since I have heard it, when he was elected in 1881, he relinquished his role as an elder in a local congregation, and he said, "I resigned the highest office in the land to become president of the United States." That's pretty cool, isn't it? The highest office on this earth would be to serve as an elder in the Lord's church. I think he's right about that. And so he stepped down from that in order to become president of the United States. You think about, man, how high could I get here in this country? Well, the president is pretty high. And we may have qualms about leadership in office, but that is a high office to be held in high regard. It's sad because I'm not sure that there'd ever be a member of the church that would even be able to get close to enough votes to be in the office. But I think he is right that he resigned. He stepped down from his position there in order to become president. Another quote that I didn't put on the screen is one morning he was being urged to meet on a Sunday morning at 10 o'clock. We got some important business, presidential type business to take care of. And he said, "I've got a standing meeting at 10 a.m. every Sunday. I'm going to meet with the Lord's people. I'm going to meet around the Lord's table." So we won't have a presidential meeting on Sunday. I think that's pretty neat. He had things in a right perspective. I'm just saying this to you. It's not so because he said it. It's so because that's the highest office that there is, and it's worthy of honor. In 1 Thessalonians 5, beginning of verse 12, Paul said, "We ask you, brothers, to respect those who labor among you and are over you in the Lord and admonish you, and to esteem them very highly in love because of their work. Be at peace among yourselves." And so Paul, no doubt here, he's writing to brethren. He says, respect those who labor among you and are over you in the Lord. Esteem them very highly. And again, why do we esteem them very highly? Well, we esteem them very highly because of their work, because of the work that they're doing. It's an important work. God put it in place for a reason. And so they ought to be esteemed highly because of their work state. And so esteem the elders. What does that mean? Well, it means we give them respect. We look up to them when they're faithfully serving. Elders are overseers. And the role suggests that they are making sure everything is overseen, making sure things that are run smoothly how they ought to be. And again, they watch out for our souls, making sure that we're fed spiritually, making sure that we're eating good from a spiritual perspective. They're looking out for spiritual dangers. Those are all things I think we take for granted sometimes. I know that I take for granted sometimes. Now, we all as individuals, we got to be watching out for spiritual dangers. But the church is being overseen by elders who are watching out for us. And that's a tall task. I think it's a sad observation. I mentioned a few minutes ago that not many men are qualified and even less maybe are willing. That's just a sad observation to where we're at. We ought to be working toward getting young people to be qualified and then be willing to take the role. So what an important work needs to be done, and what respect should be shown toward those that are serving in that role. Now, we've said before, and I want to say again, just because you're in that role doesn't mean that we should ignore sinful things if they exist or come up. You know, Paul wrote to Timothy in 1 Timothy 5, beginning of verse 19. It says, against an elder receive not an accusation, but before 2 or 3 witnesses. Them that sin rebuke before all, that others also may fear. And so, you need to be careful about receiving accusations against an elder. That's what's under consideration here. No one's above criticism, but there's a difference between honest criticism and then false accusations. And that's what Paul was talking to Timothy about. So somebody comes up and says, I've got this accusation against the elders. Paul just told Timothy, you got to be careful. Actually, don't receive it at all unless there are 2 or 3 witnesses. Obviously, if something like that happens, then if there's sin, they need to be rebuked before all, so that others also may fear, not follow after. But on both sides of this equation here, if there's an accusation, because of the position of the office, we ought to be careful not to just entertain accusations without 2 or 3 witnesses there. You know, I think all of us, maybe to some degree or another, have been hurt by slander. Somebody says something about you. Maybe a lie has been told against you. And it's just a totally false thing. Somebody has totally slandered you and said something wrong about you. And that's very hurtful, obviously. But false accusations made against an elder can have a devastating effect upon the church. And so, because of the nature of the work that elders are engaged in, sometimes people are going to be upset from time to time. You know, that's the nature of dealing with people. I know that because I do that in my secular job every day. People are going to be upset from time to time. And none of us are perfect. These are things that I think we need to know as we approach things. And so the person that is upset and the person handling the issue that's upset, neither one of them are perfect. And so sometimes accusations could be made because somebody's disgruntled. Maybe somebody's bitter. And so they embellish an accusation against, in this case, we're talking about elders, against an elder. How ought we to handle that? Well, you know, we got to be careful about that. Receive not an accusation, but before 2 or 3 witnesses. Obviously, if it's true, we've got to deal with it. But it's got to be handled in the right way. And so, if there's a legitimate charge, we've got to deal with it. But the point I want to make is, we just can't. We've got to be careful. First off, that we're not making those accusations, but then that we're not entertaining them. That's a position to be honored. You know, I think that one of the things with those that rule over us in our country, you know, our politicians and things, it's so, and because of media, everything they do, I mean, every speaking that they do, they pronounce a word wrong, or they, slip and fall as they're walking on the stage. Everybody, that's going to be played over and over, and we're going to be, people are going to be making fun of them. But when we're talking about honoring those that are ruling over us, we got to be careful for our first reaction not to be to nitpick. And again, we'll talk about that as we go. But we need to honor that position. Thirdly, we need to pray for the church here, but we also need to pray for the elders that are ruling over us. Actually, tonight, Paul led us in prayer. He mentioned our leadership here, and that's a good thing. And actually, I notice it pretty often. But Paul told Timothy in 1 Timothy 2 and verse 1, he says, I exhort therefore that, first of all, supplications, prayers, intercessions, and giving of thanks be made for all men, for kings and for all that are in authority, that we may lead a quiet and peaceable life in all godliness and honesty. So, there should be prayers offered for a lot of different areas of life. Those who are kings, those that are in authority. I think that would include those that are working with us as elders in this group. We ought to be praying for them. And so maybe that's a challenge that we can make for ourselves. I mean, how often do you pray for the success of the church here at College View? I know that I could do better at that. And I would venture to guess that we all could say we could do better at that. As a group, pray for the group here at College View. There's people that are struggling. Pray for them. But pray for the success of all of us. Pray for our elders as well. Prayers need to be made for all men, and I think that would include them as well. Elders would fall under that category. Let's be praying for them. And I would just say, if there were ever people that need our prayers to be offered for, it'd be those that are leading us, right? We want them to lead in a right way. We want them to lead us so that we can continue to be successful. And so I think the elders should be praying for their success, but I think it would be good for them to know that we're praying for them too. And so let's make sure we're doing that. In Ephesians 6 and verse 19, Paul told the Ephesians, "Pray on my behalf, that utterance may be given to me in the opening of my mouth, to make known with boldness the mystery of the gospel." Paul was a pretty strong character. Spiritually, he was a strong character. And he was traveling around and he was preaching to people. We've talked about Paul's work, really impressed with Paul. And you would think, Paul, he wouldn't be so much worried about if people were praying for him. Paul was praying for himself and his own success. But for him to ask the brethren at Ephesus, pray on my behalf. Pray for me in the work that I'm doing so that I can be successful. Now here he was talking about preaching the gospel. Pray for me so that I can have success. I think that's a pattern we could follow. Pray for us to be successful. And so serious work needs to be done here, and so serious prayer needs to be offered because of that work. And so Paul said he would like for the Ephesians to be praying for him. In Hebrews 13, beginning of verse 17, this is going back to the verses we looked at previously. We read verse 17, "Obey your leaders, submit to them, for they are keeping watch over your souls as those who will have to give an account. Let them do this with joy and not with groaning, for that would be of no advantage to you." So that's what we read earlier. And then he says, "Pray for us, for we are sure that we have a clear conscience, desiring to act honorable in all things." So the Hebrew writer, after talking about, you need to hold that office in high regard, obey your leaders, submit to them, then praying for them is mentioned right after that. And so if our desire would be that our elders would faithfully carry out their work, then it'd be appropriate for us to pray for them in their work. Fourthly, I think we just need to say we need to work with them. We need to submit to them. We need to honor them and pray for them, but we need to work with them. There's a burden on us. Now, again, we're talking about the responsibilities of the congregation. There's responsibilities of elders. There's some things that they need to be doing. They need to be leading in a good and a right way. We expect them to do that, and I know that is the goal and the intent for the elders that we have. But one of our responsibilities is to work with them. It's not just all up to them. It's not, well, we have elders for that. They should do that. I don't really have to do anything because they have to do that. Those are all wrong ways of thinking. We need to be working with them. They've got work to do, but so do we, right? In Ephesians 4, beginning at verse 11, Paul said, he gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, and shepherds and teachers to equip the saints for the work of the ministry, for the building up of the body of Christ. And we'll just stop right here just a minute. So there's all these different offices in the church, and they were designed to equip the saints. They're designed to build up the body of Christ. Obviously, in a time that Paul was writing, he's talking about apostles and prophets. We don't have apostles today, we don't have prophets, but we do have evangelists, we have shepherds and teachers. Those offices are put in place in order for the body to be built up, to equip the saints for the building up of the body. A few verses later, down here in verse 16, he said, "From whom the whole body, joined and held together by every joint with which it is equipped, when each part is working properly, makes the body grow so that it builds itself up in love." So Paul says here that each individual part is to be working together to help the body grow. When each part is working properly, then that will make the body grow. We want the body to grow, right? We want to grow numerically. I think we need to be busy in that regard, trying to get more people in. And I know that we're inviting people. I know that we're doing things to try to help our numbers grow. But we want to grow spiritually. We want to get stronger. And if we're not all working, if everything's not working properly here, as Paul said, well, then the body's going to struggle to grow. So each part needs to be working properly to help the body grow so that it's built up. And so you've got a part to play. I've got a part to play. We all have a part to play in order to do our job, in order to help the group here be successful. To sort of go, I don't want to go back too far, but I should have put this slide in here. One of the things, if we're working right in order to be successful, we said that this is on the elders' part. Let them do this with joy and not with groaning. If we're not working how we ought to be, then that's going to be more of a groaning situation than a joyous situation, right? But if we're working how we ought to be working, then they could have joy, and we all would be working together properly. And so, Paul, really important verses there about the different offices, different roles that need to be accomplished in order for the body to be successful. I want to go back here to 1 Thessalonians 5. We read these verses earlier. We focused on verse 12 more, but one of the things that we focused on was esteeming them highly. But what about this? It says esteeming them highly in love because of their work. Esteem them highly in love because of their work. As we are working with them, we ought to do so in a loving way. The golden rule, the so-called golden rule, would be to do unto others as you would have them do unto you. We ought to treat them the way that we would want to be treated. From the outside looking in, I think it's easy for me to say, oh, you know, the elders aren't doing as much as they should be doing. They need to be doing more. They could be doing better. And I think that's easy for us to kind of throw those things, and I'm not in that position, so it's easy for me to criticize. Again, nobody's above constructive criticism, but if we are loving as we ought to, then we ought to be doing so. If we have some feedback, if we have something that we think could be done better, then we ought to go take that to them and talk to them about it. Ought not to just sit back and do nothing and then talk about how they should be doing better, right? And I think that's what Paul was getting at here when he's talking about esteem them highly in love because of their work. And so sometimes I think maybe we make unreasonable or even unscriptural demands. Maybe we say, again, that they should be doing things better. But if I put myself in their shoes, then maybe I can better appreciate them and cooperate them and then work with them. In 1 Peter 5 and verse 3, it says, neither as being lords over God's heritage, but being examples to the flock. So again, this is kind of on the elders' part. They shouldn't be acting as lords over God's heritage, but they ought to be examples to the flock. An example is one you'd follow after, right? If they're setting a good example, then I ought to be doing the work of following after the example. And so in them doing that work, let's follow. They are leading. We need to be following their good example. In Hebrews 13 and verse 7, the Hebrew writer there says, remember them which have the rule over you, who have spoken unto you the word of God, whose faith follow, considering the end of their conversation. So notice this. Those that rule over you is what we're considering, whose faith ought to be followed. And then it says, considering the end of their conversation. Now, the King James word conversation here is manner of life. And just think about what this is saying. Considering the end of their manner of life. Follow them because they're trying to lead you to get to heaven. Now again, we're saying not everybody is perfect. I'm sure there is constructive criticism that we could all offer. But they're trying to lead us to get to heaven. Follow their faith. Consider the end of their manner of life because that's where it's pointing us to. That's where it's leading to. I think the ESV and the New American Standard says imitate their faith. Imitate their faith, those that rule over you. Again, because they're desiring that we go to heaven. And we should want to follow their example because that's where we should want to go as well. And so just trying to bring this thing to a close, I thought we'd just talk about the responsibilities of the congregation toward elders. Because it's easy for us, I think, to talk about what the elders should be doing for me or elders should be doing for us. but what should we be doing in order to help the church be successful? Though I don't think this is exhaustive by any means, but I think these are 4 main points to think about. Submit to them, honor them, pray for them, work with them. Just to close, I think I would just say that, if we constantly second guess, criticize, maybe even gossip about the elders, that's going to be a grief for them. That's not going to make their work difficult. That's going to make it more hard. It's already a tall task. And so I think I need to be better about making sure that as we're working here, we want to be successful. And these are some things that I think could help us, submit to them. We're not always going to agree. My ideas may not be theirs, but I need to submit to them. They're ruling over me. And God gave them that authority. I need to honor them because of the work that they're doing. Pray for them and all of us. And then work with them. I think we need to take a good look at ourselves. I do. And see, what can I do more? What can I do better? Am I doing as much as I can? I think we would all probably say, I can do more. I can do better. One of the things that we need to keep in mind is if we don't do these things, if we sort of try to be at odds with the leadership, then we're going to have to answer for our poor attitude. We're going to have to answer for our conduct. And that's what we don't want. So we want this to be a positive thing. I think our elders here are trying to lead us toward heaven. And if we'll do these things and work with them, we will be all headed that way, and that's what we want. All right. Appreciate your good attention tonight. I know this was kind of a lesson just to really talk about the relationship between us and the elders, but I think it's one that's necessary. We have some responsibilities, and I think it's possible to fulfill those responsibilities. There are no churches with perfect people in them, and if there was a church with all perfect people, then they wouldn't want any of us to be a part of that group. And so just know that, have a little bit of understanding whenever you're dealing with people, because I certainly am not perfect, and nobody else is either. But we've got the same goal in mind. So we love each other, right? And we want to work toward heaven. And that's what our elders are trying to lead us toward. And I think that's what everybody here wants. So let's work together to make this thing be successful. All right, pray for the work here at College View. As we bring the lesson to a close, we just want to extend the invitation. If there's anybody here that's not a Christian, you've got the opportunity to do that. We want to help you in that regard. We want to have you be in good standing with God so that you can go to heaven with us. And so if you haven't obeyed the gospel, please consider doing that by hearing the word of God, believing it, repenting of your sins, confessing your faith, and then being baptized. If you'd like to do that tonight, we'd baptize you into Christ tonight. We'd just be happy to do that. And maybe if you need the prayers of the church here, you feel like you haven't been living up to your commitment to God, we can pray for you and with you in that regard as well. If you have a need, come forward while we stand and while we sing.